Hi there, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about source documentation and case report forms. These are going to be really important aspects of your job as a clinical research coordinator. So let's talk a little bit about them. So what is a source document? We said that's what we're going to talk about, source documentation, but what exactly does that mean? A source document is defined not in the Code of Federal Regulations, oddly enough, but it is clearly defined in the ICH. All information in original records of clinical findings, observations, or other activities in a clinical trial necessary for the reconstruction and evaluation of the trial. Remember, the FDA is going to want to be able to, in order to say a drug is safe and effective, they might want to go back and look at all those clinical findings and observations. So some examples of source documents would be things like lab reports, any kind of radiology report, an X-ray, MRI, that kind of thing, EKG readings, physician progress notes, nurses' notes. So basically all those things that you would consider to be part of a patient's medical record. I have an easier definition. I like the ICH definition. I'm glad we have it, but I would like to give you a sort of an easier, smaller definition that'll stick with you a little bit better, because you're going to want to know, and it's important to know, what is a source document. So I say it's the place where clinical observations are first recorded. Okay, that first record sort of gets to be the clue here. It's sort of the important factor. It can be a hard copy, it can be a handwritten physician's progress note, it can be an electronic record. It doesn't matter. It's really just the first place where information is recorded. That is sort of like the origin of everything. So you want to think it's the first place where it has been recorded. Because later on, and we're going to talk later in this lecture about this data, and this information is going to eventually be moved along and shared with other people, but the source document is the first place it's recorded. So speaking of source documents, I want to talk about proper documentation. There are these 5 elements that are important to proper documentation, and if you remember the acronym ALCOA, that will help you. And the very first one, A, is attributable. You always have to sign and date the notes that you write. Now, in an electronic system, there are audit trails, so you don't really actually sign and date anything, but the audit trail relays exactly the chronology of when things were recorded, and also by user name and password who made those records. So attributable is easy in an electronic system, but if it's a hard copy and you're writing by hand, you have to sign and date. Legible, you have to be able to read it. The electronic systems take care of that for us, right? You can always read those, but penmanship really still counts. It has to be read also in terms of your signature. So some people have crazy signatures that no one knows who signed it. So it has to be the entry as well as the signature. Contemporaneous, the date and time actually accurately reflects the time of entry. And that again happens in an audit trail with an electronic record. But again, if it was a hard copy, I would date and time my entry. I would also date and time all my entries, but I could also include if it was a late entry. So if I remembered today that I forgot to document something from yesterday, I would say late entry and put the date, my note, sign it, and date and time the entry. Phew, that's a lot. Original, proper documentation, the best, you always want to be able to tell it's an original copy, because copies can be altered, and it has to be accurate, or conflicting data recorded elsewhere. This can be very tricky. The more people you have working in a patient record, the more likely that you're going to have conflicting data, and that's an element of being human. So you could have 2 physicians see the same patient a week apart, and there can be conflicting data just because they're human. So remember those, this is ALCOA, these are sort of the traits of proper documentation. So what are some of the elements of quality documentation? I already mentioned that it has to be legible. And so I have an example here of what my quality document would look like. And I found this little image of doctors are so smart, why is their handwriting so messy? So let's say that was my note. Now that, I think I can read that pretty well, and you probably can read that pretty well too, but the messier the handwriting gets, the more open to interpretation it is. So in this case, this is not the most legible. It's not bad, it's not horrible, but it's not good either. So I would take that and I would make that more legible, and here it is. I'm going to sign and date it. So the date and the time of my entry, and then the note. I put it before the note because that's how I was trained. You could put it after the note as well. If doctors are so smart, why is their handwriting so messy? Now that's much more legible. And then I signed my name and my title. Now what happens if I made a mistake? Because I make mistakes. I'm human, right? You're talking to someone while you're also writing. I mean, this is just part of life on the planet. I would correct it this way. So my mistake was I wrote, if doctors are so smart, why is their handwriting so messy? But I meant to write pretty. So with messy, that's my error. I would put simply one line through it. Then I would put the correct word with my initials and the date. So you would see not only what the original message was, but what the correct message should be and who made the correction. I'm the only person that should correct my notes. No one else should correct my notes because that is a reflection of my messaging and my documentation. And then I would mention that I put a single line through that error. And here's why. You don't ever want to obliterate the entry because it makes it look like there's something really suspicious going on. You see a single line, you're like, oh yeah, people make mistakes. But if you saw it scribbled out, you'd be like, oh my goodness, what was written there, right? So the obliterated entry looks like you're trying to hide something. And I actually found this online. This was an obliterated entry. This was used in a court of law, in a trial. And the infrared luminescence show, this is don't tell the cops about the robbery. So that's, I guess, not the smartest criminals in town. But you could, with a lot of forensics help, figure out what's said underneath there. But all you're going to do to your study monitors, make them super concerned that you're hiding something. So never obliterate it. So there you have the quality documentation. I said is legible. It's signed by the person who made the entry. It's dated. The correction is never obliterated. A single line with the correction and your initials and date. And again, because you want to create a sense of confidence in your documentation, you want to do this in permanent ink because pencil is erasable. And again, it looks like maybe you're just not being fully honest. So there you have it. That's what you should think about when you are documenting at your research site. So let's talk a little bit about fraudulent documentation, right? This is the good, juicy stuff. Do people create fraudulent documentation? And yes, it does happen. I'm going to talk about two different sort of categories of fraudulence. And the first one is an act of omission. An act of omission is forgetting something. You've done this when you've gone to the grocery store, you forget something, right? So an act of omission is not putting something in a record. Now, it's really hard to say what the intent was because people are just human. And I know I've said that a lot this lecture, but it does happen where data is not included. If I was writing a nurse's note, and they can be very lengthy, I might forget to put something. I would go back and make a late entry. Right? I would make a late entry and say, you know, I forgot to, this is the information. So an act of omission only is problematic if you can prove fraudulence, which involves, did that person intentfully not include all the data? And odds are that's not the case. Odds are that it was an accident. Now, an act of commission is a little bit different. An act of commission is consciously altering data or fabricating data. So this is taking data that exists and manipulating it for some reason. Now, you can say with an act of omission, I'm human, I forgot, my bad. An act of commission is much harder to be able to say, I'm human and I made a mistake. Now this looks very intentful. Investigators and research coordinators as well who are charged with acts of commission under the federal law can go to federal prison for years and pay very large fines. There have been cases of investigators who have created totally fabricated, fictitious participants on their trials for people who never even existed. And that will land someone in jail for a very long time. I am guilty of acts of omission myself. I am not guilty of any acts of commission. So the acts of omission are much more common. If you're a research coordinator and you're involved with an investigator who is engaging in acts of commission, then you really need to find another job. So those are two types of fraudulent documentation. Now I'm going to talk about an NTF. NTF is little acronym for a note to file. So I'm talking about documentation that is going to really go onto a patient's record. But notes to file are also important tools to document. A note to file is a document you use about a study-specific event which requires an explanation. Because you want to create a study file. You have a patient record, which is information that's unique to that participant, and then you're going to have a study file. And we'll talk about this later in the semester. But your study file is all study documents, and a note to file can be an important thing you could use to explain why something happened on a study. I always used to think to myself when I was working as a coordinator that I would win the lottery and that I would buy an island somewhere and someone would have to figure out what happened with my study. So it's just sort of a way to document events. The thing about notes to file, write them in a timely manner because your memories are going to fade. Do not sit down 3 and 6 month intervals and try to remember notes to file. You have to write them in a timely manner because even if you think, oh my gosh, I will never forget this, you will forget it. So you write them right away. Write them very factual and free from emotion. Your note to file can be read from anybody from the IRB to your study sponsor to an FDA inspector. So anybody who's involved with this, you want it to be very professional, you want it to be factual, you want it to be free from emotion. You don't want to say things like your coworker's a jerk or your PI is driving you crazy, right? You're just going to stick to the facts and explain what happened. So here's a sample note to file. I have my protocol number there, I have the title of the protocol, I have it's from me, my title. Where am I going to put this note to file? In this case, I'm putting it in the subject file. And regarding this subject 015 and the initials, and then the date. And then in this case, Dr. Smith consented the subject on January 20th, dated the consent form January 22nd. The dating discrepancy is not representative of an inappropriate consent process, but the result of human error. Dr. Smith, it should say, Dr. Wolf has been reminded to confirm the correct date in the future. So, and I'm going to sign it, right? This is something that I want to be explained for anybody that comes in and looks at the file, because they're going to notice that the subject signed it on the 20th and the investigator signed it on the 22nd, when in fact that was just an error. So where do I document things? Do I put things in the patient record or do I put it in a note to file? Sometimes this can get confusing, and I promise you that once you are through your internship and you're actually working, this will become very, very easy. But I want to talk about it now because we're sort of talking about two different places and what are those functions and when would you write something in a patient record or when would you write a note to file. So patient records or anything that directly affects the patient's care. Anything that's uniquely related to that patient. Example, missed appointments, you can have telephone calls, things like that. A telephone call, patient needs a refill on a prescription, anything like that. It's related to the patient. Other healthcare providers would need this information to take care of that patient. The note to file, you would use anything that's directly related to the study or how you're performing the study. So for example, that note to file about the wrong date on the consent form, that does not affect the patient care. It is related to the execution of the study, however. It doesn't affect that individual's medical care that there were two different dates on the consent form, but it is of importance and it's worth explaining in the study. A lapsed IRB review, sponsor communication. If you talk to a sponsor and they give you advice about something, that would be a good note to file. So hopefully that sort of puts it in two different places. If you think, what is this directly related to? If it's directly related to the patient care, it goes in the patient record. And if it's directly related to the study, it becomes a note to file. All right, so we talked about the documentation that will exist at the site. Then what is a case report form? We're going to call them CRFs. The case report forms are the data collection tool for the clinical trial. Remember, our source document is the very first place information has been recorded. The case report form then is the tool we use to get the data needed for the trial. The case report forms are used to standardize the data collection process, especially if this is a large multi-center trial. So when we get to the phase 3 level, there might be 50 different sites in the United States enrolling 3,000 patients. Every site will have the same case report form, so all of the data is collected in a very standardized, uniform method. The case report forms are all designed specifically for each study protocol. The case report forms, the data that's collected on the case report forms, all of that comes from the study protocol. Case report form completion is a major part of your workload as a research coordinator and has a significant impact on data analysis. So this is important for the sponsor and for their end outcomes of getting a drug approved. So here's an example of a case report form. This would be a hard copy. So in this page, this is just one page and there are multiple pages. In this one, this is capturing all the adverse events. So in this case, we had a patient who was bleeding from a stomach ulcer. The case report form wants to know, when did it start, what date and time, when did it end, date and time, how extreme was it, what happened with the study drug, was the study drug discontinued, yes, no, permanently, temporarily, what was the outcome, and the relationship to the study drug. We'll talk more about this later as well, but this is a really important part of the job between you as the research coordinator and the investigator, because the investigator will make the determination whether the adverse event was related to the investigational drug. So that's sort of an example of one sheet, and you'll have many pages like this where they're looking for specific bits of data. So I mentioned the case report forms are important for data collection, and these are designed by the sponsor, because the sponsor has designed the clinical trial, written the protocol, and there are key developers in the development of case report forms, and these include statisticians, programmers at the sponsor, data managers, so people internally at the sponsor that are going to be analyzing the data. They are very important to the project team at the sponsor, especially for the big studies. Now, the CRAs with the study monitors use the case report forms to verify the protocol is being followed, because they want to make sure that everything, all the study endpoints are being analyzed, because the patients have gone through and they have met all of those timelines and all those procedures they're supposed to undergo. The sponsor uses the case report form to build the databases. From the database development, then they develop edit checks and then programming specifications, and this is going to be important for them as they analyze the data. There are also electronic case report forms. The example I just had before with the bleeding stomach ulcer was a hard copy, but electronic case report forms are becoming more and more popular too, and so these are paperless data capture tools. They are cheaper. Sponsors like them because of that. They are also very quicker. So with hard copies, the study monitor has to come to the site and pick up the hard copies. The electronic ones can be submitted electronically, so they're much, much faster, and they are increasing in popularity. There's always talk about eventually clinical research will be totally electronic, and I've been hearing that for decades. Eventually it will happen, but they wax and wane. They are very popular. Some places only have electronic case report form studies. Most places will still have some paper studies. So here's what a sample electronic case report form looks like. And this is just very simple. You can tell this is actually not from this country. This is a Canadian study. It's hard to find good examples of electronic case report forms online because they're usually proprietary and they're very hard to find. So you can see this one's really old, from 1995, and the status of insurance. I think this was a Canadian study, if my memory is correct. So that would be sort of what it would look like. Case report form completion is a big part of your job. You're going to have specific coding language that now when I say coding, I'm not talking about computer languages. There is going to be some language that your study sponsor is going to want you to follow. And this is why if you're taking the clinical research coordinator classes, you have to have a medical terminology class, because that kind of language has to be followed. You would want to use medical terms. You would not say nosebleed. The medical term would be epistaxis. So you would have to use that kind of language. The sponsor should provide instructions not only on the language they want, but instructions on how the case report form should be completed. It looks pretty obvious and intuitive, but it really isn't. For example, I would write the today's date as the month, the day, and the year, right? That's how we do it in the United States. If you had a European sponsor, they would want the day, the month, the year, right? So there's lots of different ways you can do this. So they're going to provide instructions on how all of those data points should be completed. The deadlines are very important. Sponsors are not interested in hearing that your site is unable to meet a deadline. Oftentimes, you'll know what the deadlines are up front, and so you will have to really bear those deadlines in mind, especially if you have multiple studies that you're working on, because you will really, really tarnish your relationship with your sponsor if you don't meet those deadlines. And we'll talk more about that later in the semester. And source document and the case report form have to match. So if the source document said the patient is 5 foot 5 inches, your case report form has to say 5 foot 5 inches. So they have to match. I know that's sort of an obvious thing, but sometimes errors happen. Your study monitor will come out and confirm that the case report form matches your source documents, but the best practice is to have them match up front so there's no corrections that have to happen. But they have to match. So the data clarification form now will follow. So the source document's the first place it's recorded. The case report form is where the data is captured for the sponsor. And the data clarification form comes about, it's generated by the sponsor to answer questions found in the database. So the case report form, the data is entered there, and then the sponsor is entered into a database. Questions will be generated. And that's a data clarification form. Data clarification forms are very time consuming, and they can really slow you down. The best way to avoid having a lot of data clarification forms is to make sure that the data is entered correctly. A good example would be if you had a clinical trial on a drug for breast cancer, postmenopausal breast cancer women. The only way you could be on the study is if you're postmenopausal, you're a woman, and you have breast cancer. If your case report form allowed you to say the patient's gender, which most of them will, even if it's a trial just for women, and you accidentally tick the patient's male, you'll get a data clarification form saying, are you sure this person's a male? This study is limited to women. So that would be a good example. If you were very good at your job and you were meticulous and not easily distracted, you would not make that error. Ideally, your study monitor would catch the error, but if he or she didn't catch that error, then the data clarification form would come to you from the sponsor and it would ask you to clarify the information. And I mentioned you can prevent a lot of data clarification forms by really having good quality data and also having a really good monitor and doing a really good job monitoring your study. So this is what the data looks like. I just talked about all this stuff, but if you're very visual, you might not really be able to piece this all together in your head. So I'm going to give you this nice visualization. So this is the data flow. The source document, the first place where things are recorded. EKG, medical records, doctor's notes, nurse's notes, lab findings. That's your source document, right? That is generated from your study participant. Specific data is collected and placed on the case report form by the research coordinator. The study monitor comes, looks at the case report form, and validates that what's on the case report form is also in the source document. Once that is validated, the case report form data is submitted to the sponsor. If it's a hard copy, the hard copy goes with the monitor. If it's an electronic case report form, that is submitted however the sponsor wants it submitted. But once everything's been validated to be correct, it's sent to the sponsor. The data from the case report form is then entered into the database, the DB, and there are edit checks put in there. This is all now happening at the sponsor. This is now out of your hands. You have the source document, you have the case report forms, and now this is at the sponsor. Queries, which are data clarification forms, are then sent to you at the site for clarification against the source. For example, the postmenopausal woman study that has a male participant. So that data clarification comes back to you, and then you can clarify it against the source document. So this is like the circle of life from a perspective of data. So hopefully this makes sense to you. If it doesn't, I want you to stop and send me an email or call me or Skype me or whatever you want to do and ask me to go over something and clarify it for you, because I'd be happy to do so. So there we have it, our reference, and you know where to find me if you have questions. Talk to you soon.